I was going to say that during the Smart Set and American Mercury phase, you were also quite active in the Sun through that column, The Freelance, that appeared every Monday.
Part of that phase. I started the freelance column in 1911 and gave it up in 1915. 4 years. It overlapped the Smart Set phase during those years. I was either literary critic of the Smart Set or editor all that time. But that column I gave up for various reasons. One thing, it was a burden. I had too many other enterprises, and doing a daily column was a very severe burden, and I began to get tired of it.
Well, you went back to that column after a lapse of years.
No.
Under another title?
No.
Didn't you?
After the First World War, when the kind of stuff that I was writing could be printed again, I went back to the Sun to write a weekly article.
That's what I meant.
That must have been in...
Monday article.
Yeah, it must have been in 1918 or 19, and I kept that up to... I kept it up 15 or 16 years at least.
And it had a tremendous impact on the life of Baltimore, as you know.
I doubt it.
Well, I can speak from personal experience.
It may have had on you personally, but on the town as a whole, my opinion is that it hardly made a ripple.
Well, I was working as a reporter
Yeah.
at the time, and I know that hardly a day went by, a week went by, when a bushel of letters didn't come in as a result of that Monday column. Letters usually calling you all kinds of names and disagreeing violently with everything you said, which was partly the object of the column.
The volume of mail that comes in to a magazine or a newspaper or a radio station is no index of anything, except that you happen to attract a lot of idiots, because most people that write letters to newspapers are fools. The intelligent people seldom do it. They do it sometimes, but not often. I used to, in my days running a column, I welcomed the letters that came in, and in fact edited them. I was in charge of the letter column and always let anybody that denounced me violently get in, because it was, I believe that people like to read abuse. And I didn't care what they said to me. I was much too vain to care what such idiots believed about me. In fact, I'd have been ashamed if they praised me. And so letters praising me very seldom got in that column.
Well, with uncharacteristic modesty, I think you're underplaying the influence of those Monday pieces on Baltimore. I came into the picture myself in 1920 as a young and somewhat starry-eyed reporter.
Yeah.
And at that time, and for the next 5 years, I mingled with the staff, with the underlings, and I know that you were regarded as a sort of a demigod, sort of a person high up on Olympus who was in contact with all the literary greats, who was discovering novelists who could have a novel published by letter of recommendation and so forth.
I think you're describing an unusual situation that might be almost described as pathological.
Well,
the trouble with you
I shared that condition.
Yeah, the trouble with you is that you were an idealist. And you took that thing much too seriously, and certainly much more seriously than I did.
Well, many of the young men were idealists at that time.
Yeah, there were more of them. They were younger to begin with. Now you're an old man, just as I am, and I'm even older, and our idealism is out. Although I must say for myself that I never was an idealist.
It doesn't exist today among the younger members of the staff now. There's no such thing as a kind of spirit that we had, a kind of ambition.
One of the things that puzzles me about the modern young newspaper man is, what does he do in his leisure? He has much more leisure than did in my time and yours. I worked all the time. He works 5 days a week. What does he do?
Well, one day he plays poker or plays golf, and the other day his wife drags him off to the movies. Or he stays home and minds the children while his wife goes out and plays bridge.
Well, all those things would have been considered not only degrading, but impossible psychologically at my time.
In 1920, most of us were bachelors, and as we would say now, wolves, playing around, very irresponsible, all of us shooting for the stars and falling short generally. Today, the majority of reporters, I think you'll find, are married and have small children and responsibility.
Yes, that's probably true, but the idea of a newspaper reporter with any self-respect playing golf is to me almost inconceivable. I hear that even printers now play golf. God almighty, that's dreadful to think of. I remember printers in my time. I knew a great many intimately. I always had to do with makeup on the papers, and hence I knew the printers. And I was very fond of them, and they were fine fellows, but golf playing it'd just seem as incredible as to hear of a printer going to a dance. Printers spent their leisure mainly in saloons, and in summer on the shores down the rivers below Baltimore. They were an intelligent man, the good ones. I learned a great deal more about the newspaper business from printers than I ever learned from editors. Great deal more. But now, when you hear of a printer going out and dressing himself up and playing golf, the thing is really obscene. It's dreadful to think of it.
Well, the New Deal certainly had its effect in newspaper offices.
Yeah.
There was when you were a young reporter, when I was a reporter, there was a great deal of freedom and camaraderie and low pay going with it and so forth, and long hours. I remember working from 1 o'clock in the afternoon till 11 at night, sometimes straight through. But today the Guild has
did
changed
that every day.
Now we have a 40-hour week and so forth, and it has changed the whole characteristic, for better or for worse.
You could no more have a 40-hour week for a good newspaper reporter than you could have a 40-hour week for an archbishop. It's just not possible. A good reporter, he simply refuses to let a story go when he's got his teeth into it. And he wants assignments. I remember when I went down the office in the morning, certainly the thing that interested me wasn't whether I'd get a lot of time off and go home early, but whether I'd get some good assignments. Mm-hmm. If I got the good assignments, I didn't care how long I worked. I've worked many a time all night. When the Baltimore fire happened in February 1904, I was a young city editor. They dug me out of bed about 11 o'clock in the morning. Said a big fire started downtown. I went downtown. I never got my clothes off or slept until Wednesday morning at 4 o'clock. That's from Sunday to Wednesday. I suppose that's almost a record for continuous work. I grant you that there were moments when I drowsed at my desk, but I never stretched out to sleep until Wednesday morning. And far from looking on that as oppressive or keeping an account of overtime, I was delighted with the opportunity. I was young, I was ambitious, and I liked the job. I get the impression from the modern reporter that he doesn't really like his work. He wishes he were a druggist.
Mm-hmm.
Or he wishes he had a good job.
Or a dramatist.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. The reporter with literary ambitions is one that I always respected. But most of the reporters that I encounter these days haven't even got literary ambitions. They never write anything outside the office.
Well, many a good reporter that we both knew has turned press agent.
Well, in my time, a press agent was looked on as a loathsome creature. Nobody paid any attention to him, and there was a rule on the Sun for many years that if a man ever became a press agent, he never could come back to the Sun.
Now he's a public relations counsel. And makes $15,000 a year.
Yeah, he's just as bad as he was before. The thing that distresses me about press agentry is a simple one. I have seen so many good men become press agents of one kind or other, and there's a subtle corruption of their minds that they never get over. They simply can't recover from that horror. They're engaged in, if they're good journalists, some of them are. Remember, the worst men didn't become press agents, but often the best. And, they know deep in their hearts that the thing is not a dignified trade. And they rationalize their necessities in one way or other, but they don't rationalize them enough to get rid of them.
You covered some very large and interesting newspaper stories in your day when you were acting independently and choosing your own assignments. I remember, for instance, the Scopes trial.
Oh.
That was a lot of fun.
Oh, it was a lot of fun.
With an overtone of tragedy, don't you think?
Yes, it was a dreadful thing to think of presumably civilized people falling into such a slough. And it was a dreadful thing to look at a man like Brian, a man with his opportunities in the world, to see what he had come to intellectually in his old age. It was a tragedy in a way, but I should add at once, it wasn't a tragedy to me. I wasn't suffering anything. I was enjoying it. I enjoyed it tremendously.
Who would not enjoy that remark, that famous remark of Brian? You remember?
What's that?
When he said that man is not a mammal?
Yeah. Well, I see nothing remarkable about that, because that is the belief of a very large section of the American people. If they're actually Christians, they can't believe that man's a mammal. Personally, I believe he is. But I have no particular horror of the man who believes it isn't. He seems to me an amiably comic character, just like a man who believes that if you put a horsehair in a bottle of water, it'll turn into a snake. Or the man who believes that Friday is an unlucky day. I should add at once that I am one of those who do believe that Friday is an unlucky day. And like nearly all agnostics, I'm very superstitious. And I would no more undertake any work of importance on Friday the 13th than I'd jump off a house.
You are still an agnostic. You held very faithfully to that.
Yeah. I was born an agnostic. My father was one ahead of me and his father ahead of him. So agnosticism is nothing new to me. I'll point out one of the strange corollaries, and that is this. A man who is an agnostic by inheritance, so that he doesn't remember any time that he wasn't, has almost no hatred for the religious. I get on very well with all kinds of ecclesiastics and all kinds of pious people, because I don't have any evil conscience in the matter. I'm not a renegade.
No feeling of sin.
No feeling of sin whatever. I assume that they've got a right to believe anything they please. Being an extreme libertarian and believing in free speech and every other kind of freedom up to the last limits of the endurable. I think there is a limit beyond which free speech can't go, but it's a limit that's very seldom mentioned. It's the point where free speech begins to collide with the right to privacy. I don't think there are any other conditions in free speech. I've got a right to say and believe anything I please, but I haven't got a right to press it on anybody else. For example, take, for instance, the Catholic Church, which I am on good terms with personally, but have no belief in whatsoever. I've got a right to print my dissent from its doctrines, to utter them. I have exercised that right for many years. But I have no right to go on the cathedral steps on Sunday morning when the Catholics are coming out of High Mass and make a speech denouncing them. I don't think there is any such right. Nobody's got a right to be a nuisance to his neighbors.
Or to hurt his neighbor's feelings.
To hurt their feelings wantonly. If they come to him and say, what do you think of this Mass that we've just finished? I think he has a right to answer. But he has no right to press his opinions on them. Well, of course, you'll notice the peculiar thing about the United States, where there is very little free speech. Free speech is a very limited right in this country, as I have learned to my bitter experience more than once. Yet it is a country where the right to press opinions on reluctant hearers is carried to a development that is unheard of on earth. whole country's full of propagandists who are bothering everybody all the time. I get in the mail every morning tremendous piles of propaganda of one kind or other, and I can easily imagine a man who would resent that, who would think it's a nuisance, and he ought to have there ought to be some way to save him from that annoyance. Personally, I don't care, because when I get propaganda and with it there is one of those reply-plate postal cards or envelopes, I always send it back empty, without any writing on it. I have to pay 4 cents to get it back, and it's my quiet way of saying, not for you.
I think now time for a little comedy relief. That's a pretty serious subject.
Yeah.
You know, we haven't touched on politics, and you have covered every national convention from way back, didn't you?
Not everyone. I missed some.
Both Republican and Democratic.
Yeah. Well, in politics, I'm a complete neutral. I think they're all scoundrels without exception. There are, especially that is true of the reformers. I've known politicians by the thousand all my life, and I'm here to tell you that the most pleasant men, and on the whole the most honest of them, are what are ordinarily looked on as machine politicians.
That's enough for politicians. They shouldn't take up too much time, should they?
No, that's enough for them.
At a certain point, you drifted out of journalism and other things into the field of scholarship. In your studies of the American language as embodied in your books, would you say a few words as to how and why that transition occurred?
That wasn't a transition. I never have been a scholar and never pretended to be one. My interest in American speech began in my young repertorial days. I'd listened to the testimony in police courts, and it was a level of society it was unfamiliar to me, and I was fascinated by it, and the talk of policemen and so on. And I began making notes about it and wrote a couple of newspaper pieces about it, and I found that a lot of other people were interested, and they began writing to me, and I accumulated material, and finally the thought occurred to me that it would make a book. And I wrote the book, and both my publisher and I believed that it had a rather limited appeal. We printed it in a limited edition, and the edition was sold out.
That was the American language.
First edition, 1918 or 19. It sold out so fast, and once it got out, the amount of material came pouring in so enormously that I was just forced to write another edition, and then another, and then another. And then it got so enormous that I had to write appendixes. But I never pretended to be a scholar. I was a sort of scout for scholars. I accumulated the material and tried to put it into a readable form so that people could understand it, and to suck out of it whatever human juices were there, and there were plenty. And my hope and idea was that the material that I had accumulated and pre-digested in a way would be used by actual philological scholars. That hope was vain. Very few of them showed any interest in it. Even today, the more Tony ones seem to think that it's rather infra-dig to show any active interest in the language that 140 million people speak. They show a great deal of interest in obscure and nonsensical languages, which hardly anyone speaks, but they haven't yet brought themselves, I'm speaking of the Tony ones, to studying the language of their people. That is not to be taken without qualification, because a great many of the younger ones have shown an interest, and they have maintained American speech for years. They print books on the subject, and they do a lot of interesting work, but the thing hasn't been organized in the grand manner as yet. As long as the scholars fail to take it over, I continue it because I can't help it. I have got enough material for 5 more volumes in my house at this minute.
It's an endless task, isn't it? You just go on and on.
It comes in endless forms. I only last week I got a letter from a man, notes that he had made on my second supplement. The notes ran to more than 5,000 words, additions, corrections, suggestions, and they were very interesting and valuable. Well, they go into my file. Now, I'm an old man, and I'll probably be an angel soon. I've got to think of what to do with them. And I have resolved to leave them to a library where anybody else who's interested can get them. And some of them are newspaper clippings, magazine articles, learned journals. I read all the philological journals. And an enormous number of letters, suggestions about people all over the world and of every rank. In my second supplement, the authorities referred to in the notes include an admiral in the Navy, a general in the Army, and 5 or 6 lifers in penitentiaries. They include newspaper men of every rank, from young reporters to proprietors. And they include every kind of person conceivable, probably to the number of 10,000. All that stuff is in my files, badly indexed, but still sorted out enough for a man to use it. And I had wondered what to do with it. I decided to put it in a library where all comers can use it as they please.
Do you consider the Dictionary of American English useful?
Very. I think it's a valuable work. It's got defects. The main defect is that Sir William Craigie, who was the editor, was not an American. He's a highly competent philolog and a man of good common sense, but the endless little decisions that had to be made as that work went along, the fact that he was a foreigner showed itself quite often. The book is now being rewritten by an American, Dr. Matthews of Chicago, and I think Matthews will improve it. such books, they do not, they're not born full grown. It takes time. One of the sad things about the Dictionary of American English is this, that Americans gave it no help. When the new English dictionary was underway, thousands of Englishmen read for it and worked for it. Craigie made appeals constantly for help. You'd think that teachers of English, of whom I have been told there are 100,000 in America, would have helped him. Most teachers of English are very low grade mentally, and they seem to be not interested in the slightest. They gave him almost no help. And without that volunteer cooperation, it's almost impossible to do such a dictionary completely. But within those limits, despite those handicaps, I think Craigie and his colleagues did a fine work. There's very little in it that needs expunging. It's reasonably comprehensive with some horrible holes in it. And altogether, it does him credit. I have never criticized it. It's been criticized rather severely, but I always defended it. I don't know Craigie, never saw him in my life.
Henry, in all these years, you've been a fabulously busy man. Everybody knows that. You've always worked and worked. Your principal relaxation has been music, hasn't it?
If you can call it a relaxation, I devote very little time to music. My principal relaxation has been work.
Do you still have those weekly meetings with
Yeah.
that group of other musicians?
They've been going on over 40 years. And we're getting old. Some of our members are 80 years old.
You still play the piano
Yeah.
for that group? How many are in the group now?
I think there are 11 at the moment. I play the second piano. I'm not good enough to play piano as a major instrument. I never practice, don't want to acquire a technique. I've always believed early in life that it's foolish for an amateur to get too good. He wastes too much time on music and it becomes an obsession and a curse to him. I want music for pleasure, not
That's
as a
what it should
labor.
be.
Yeah, not as a labor. I don't go to hear music much because I dislike sitting in seats confined for an hour or two between maybe unpleasant people and having to hear stuff that I maybe don't want to hear. When you go to a concert, you've got to take what the professor offers. I go up to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania every spring to the Bach choir to hear them sing Bach's B minor Mass. That doesn't annoy me so much because it's a pleasant trip in beautiful spring weather usually, and whatever they give on the first day, which is usually Bach cantatas, on the second day I'm sure of hearing something that I've chosen myself and that I want to hear. That is Bach's B minor Mass. I believe everybody that loves music wants to hear it at least once a year. It's one of the great masterpieces of the world, and it's done very well. And the surrounding atmosphere is excellent. The town of Bethlehem pays no attention to the proceedings, whatever. They don't bother you. They don't put up any hot dog stands or try to sell you flags. And their hotels do not increase their prices. And it's happily free of every sign of American festivity. Have you ever been up there?
I never have.
Well,
I've always wanted to go, and I
Yeah.
just haven't.
Unfortunately, it's got to be rather expensive. But after all,
As what hasn't?
Yeah, it's only once a year.
By the way, what kind of a cigar is that you're trying to keep lighted?
That's a cigar made in Baltimore that I smoke relatively rarely. I mainly chew it. I chew cigars while I'm working. I'm one of the last remaining tobacco chewers left in America, and I never chew chewing tobacco, but only cigars. And this is a good, clean cigar made of honest American tobacco. It has a pleasant taste, and it's not deleterious in any way, and I've done it for years and suffered no ill effects that I can notice. When I smoke, I ordinarily smoke more expensive cigars, but I don't smoke a great deal.
Just one more topic, and that is, as you know, at the present time, television has become a great factor in newspaper work. All over the country, newspapers are setting up television stations at the cost of $1 million or so, and there's a revolution going on among newspaper men who are brought into the new field. What do you think of television?
I think it's a curse to newspapers, and I wish it could be separated from them. I am sorry that the Federal Communications Commission did not prohibit ownership of radio stations by newspapers. I don't think it's a good thing in the public sense for any one agency to control rival news sources. They ought to be kept separate and in active rivalry. That's one objection to it. Secondly, human nature being what it is, as soon as a television or any kind of radio enterprise gets into a newspaper, an enormous number of men, including some of the best men, become radio crooners, not newspaper men.
They become actors.
Actors, yeah. They get stage struck, in brief. That's the truth. And it shows in the newspaper instantly. The way for newspapers to meet the competition of radio and television is simply to get out better newspapers. They can always keep miles ahead of these other agencies, which happen the machinery for doing what newspapers can do. Newspapers ought to print better papers. They're going downhill, and any time you find a newspaper that's got a radio department, you find a newspaper deteriorating.
What do you think of the actual programs on television that you've seen, apart from their connection with journalism?
I have seen very few. Those I have seen, I must say, are terrible. I had never realized that presumably sane human beings would waste their time looking at such stuff.
I take it that you haven't seen my Sunday night program.
Unfortunately, I haven't seen it. I hear it's wonderful.
I've taken the plunge. I've gone in up to my neck.
Well, you're another man lost to journalism, where you're a valuable man, in my judgment. I think you know your trade and do it very well. And this is not just an afterthought, because I've said it many times around the office.
Oh, thank you.
I think every moment you spend on television is at the cost of the newspaper.
Well, it has its compensations. When we get back to Baltimore, I have a day to interview a very beautiful actress over television, Diana Barrymore, John Barrymore's daughter.
That's pleasant, but since when have newspaper men not had that felicity?
Well,
when I was a young reporter, merely 50 years ago, I used to interview beautiful actresses and get mashed on them sometime. But I don't think that that's any advantage at all. I believe in Gresham's law, bad money drives out good. And if suppose a man were running a fine restaurant, which to me is one of the greatest of all human enterprises, one of the most socially useful things. A man that runs a good eating house is a valuable citizen. All right. He's running an eating house, and he notices that hot dog stands and lunch wagons are proliferating in the neighborhood, and he says, by God, I better look out or they'll fetch me someday. So he goes out and buys a dozen lunch wagons and opens them around the neighborhood, and he makes money. Nevertheless, I don't believe that that's a good idea. I don't think newspapers should run radio stations. I grant you that they may be profitable, although not television.
Well, I think in spite of all that you've said, I think you yourself are somewhat of an idealist. And on that note, we will close. We have to get back to Baltimore. By the way, what do you have to do today? What is your chore for today after we get back?
The rest of the day?
Yes.
I want to get in the office about 2:30 if I can. We've got to get lunch somewhere along the way. And after that, I've got nothing pressing. I'm working on an article. I'll do that tonight if it's not so hot. You say you're going to close on the note of idealism.
Yeah.
That's, to me, catastrophe.
The last word spoken by Mr. Mencken, the word catastrophe, unfortunately proved to be prophetic with regard to himself. A few months after that June day, he suffered the stroke which incapacitated him as a writer. As for Mr. Mencken's curiosity as to whether or not this recording will be listened to by posterity, well, the answer to that one is up to you.
That's all.